We have a second special guest speaker. To introduce that guest speaker and to give him a full and proper introduction, we have a person here by the name of Ron Gostick, who is well known as a Canadian publisher and author and journalist and writer, as well as speaker. Would you welcome, please, Mr. Ron Gostick?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I should say this is the second meeting that I've addressed in the last 10 minutes. We had one out in the hallway a minute ago with some characters that were very interested in the Holocaust, and they thought there was a Holocaust meeting going on in here, Mr. Chairman. We had great difficulty persuading them that it must be in some other hall. Anyway, they've left. This afternoon, it's my privilege to introduce to you a person that I haven't known that long myself. But I can assure you that in the little time that I have known him, he's made a very deep impression upon me. And I'm talking about David Irving, the British historian. David Irving, of course, is the writer of many bestsellers, going way back to the destruction of Dresden. He also is the British historian who exposed and blew up the so-called Hitler diaries 3 or 4 years ago that caused a great international news story. He is probably the most renowned and highly respected research historian in the English-speaking world. And we've had an opportunity the past 10 days to have him speaking from Vancouver east. We're heading for Montreal now. And in 15 days, he's addressing 15 different meetings in Canada in 15 different cities. This afternoon, he's going to speak to you on the manipulation of history. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to you Mr. David Irving.
There are 8 million stories in the naked city of Toronto. Last night, driving back from London, Ontario, where I addressed a meeting, as Ron correctly told you, last night driving back, I stopped my car at an intersection in Yonge Street and Bloor Street and found to my horror that the man sitting in the next car, his features distorted with hatred, was Simon Wiesenthal. Yeah! These ugly, cruel features were leering at me over the steering wheel, and for a moment I had a nightmare. I realized, in fact, it wasn't, of course, it was a Halloween mask. I understand there's a story, and I may be completely untrue, that, in fact, at Halloween, on the day after Halloween, Mrs. Wiesenthal says, "Simon, please put the mask back on." We shouldn't be too unkind on Mr. Wiesenthal, of course. He has done a certain amount of in-depth, detailed research into history, and we mustn't forget that Simon Wiesenthal, despite many weeks and months of patient research on the case of Kurt Waldheim, was unable to turn up anything at all in the archives, except rumors that Waldheim had once applied for membership of the Bund Deutscher Mädchen. I mention these facts because, of course, Wiesenthal is a plague upon us all, and he must be deeply upset that that great prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, has been awarded to another man and not to himself, a man who is a professional survivor, a messenger of the survival of the Holocaust. Personally, I don't begrudge him the prize. If my name was Weasel for the rest of my life, I think I too. Although, what we do know is that none of these historians, the Weasels, the Wiesenthals, none of the great academic historians, indeed, of the world, have told us the whole truth. And if I'm known for something as a historian, it's because I don't shun talking about any aspect of the truth. I regret deeply when the results of my publication cause myself, my agents, my publishers, my family, of course, also distress and terror. I've had my front door in England sledgehammered. I know that your writers in Canada also come up against these increasing problems. I've had printing works burned down that published my works in England. I've had my own home raided by people purporting to be members of the General Post Office in Britain. They came equipped with all the identity cards and so on. They claimed to be from the Post Office. I caught the lot of them. We all found out who was really behind it. The police came and told me later on which organization was behind it. They went to prison, of course. and I'm not going to reveal details of these gentlemen concerned who are still residing in prison, because if I reveal details about the organization behind them, I would be accused of anti-Semitism. I think it's necessary to say these things because, of course, the writing of history has become an increasingly dangerous occupation for us here in the West. And this is because there is the old truth, the old witticism, the old wisdom, in fact, that if you are not prepared to learn from history, then you're condemned to repeat it. And we're not wanting to repeat history. We have seen in the last 50 years how an evil force, an evil power has encroached upon more and more of the surface of this globe, and the number of people still living in freedom, the number of people still living in the West is now reduced to about 1/3 or 1/4 of the total population of the world, and it's our duty really to stand up, to recognize ourselves, to identify the friends of freedom, and to perceive who are in fact the enemies of that cause. It's our duty to do that, whatever the risks and the dangers that we expose ourselves to. And since I set out on my one-man crusade, is circling the globe 2 times already since I came here in Toronto, going around the world, not because anybody is paying me to do it. I'm not paid by the CIA or by the British government or the South African government or by Martin Bormann's secret checks or by anything like that. I just finance myself by going around the world carrying heavy suitcases full of books. And I speak and I sell my books. Regrettably, I've got no books to offer you today because I think you probably know what's happened here in Canada. My famous book on the Hungarian uprising of 1956, published in England by one of our oldest and most respectable publishing houses, the Hodder and Stoughton Company. We imported 2,000 copies of that into Vancouver, where my tour started, and they have been impounded by the Canadian customs, as though there was some kind of shoddy work of pornography. And I suppose copies have been sent along to Ottawa to be investigated by the customs officials there, along with copies of Girl Scout Gangbang and all the other works upon which they should really be dedicating their attention. My book will not be available probably for several days, probably just after I've left Canada. Will they release it and they will realize their mistake? And of course the people behind this particular little episode are the people who are forced to identify themselves with the villains of the Hungarian uprising of 1956. When they read my history of the Hungarian uprising, they see that I quite clearly identify the people's uprising of 1956 in Hungary as having all the traces, all the characteristics of a pogrom. It started as a pogrom and eventually it evened out, but the initial phases, it was quite clearly a pogrom. And if you read the interrogations that were carried out by the CIA of the thousands of survivors who came out, as I have done, I've read all those interrogations, you see that the CIA, the British, the Americans, the Germans who questioned all these people identified the pogrom quality in the initial phases of the uprising. The regime in Hungary was identified quite clearly as having a certain character. It had been imposed on Hungary by the Soviet Union. The people concerned, Revai, Farkas, Gerő, Rákosi, all these cruel, murderous Hungarian leaders who were imposed on Budapest in 1945, 1946, rode into power not on a democratic wave of popular support. They were brought back into power by the Soviet tanks. They were all members of a certain faith. The people they employed were also members of a certain faith, which is understandable because they were the ones, of course, the Jews and the communists picked to run their terror system, the Államvédelmi Hatóság, the secret state police authority in Hungary. And this is a very ugly truth. It was a truth that was once spoken, in fact, by Winston Churchill back in 1920. An article by Churchill on the Zionists and the Zionist origins of the Bolshevik Revolution, an article which he wrote and was published in the London Illustrated Weekly. And it was so vicious, this writing by Winston Churchill back in 1920, that at first I thought that it was a fake. And I'm something of a specialist in fake documents. As you know, I'm the one who exposed the Hitler diaries as being fake right in the middle of the press conference of Der Stern magazine back in April 1983. I exposed them as fake, and I explained why I thought those documents were fake. And I thought that this Winston Churchill article on the Zionists was a fake. But no, it was completely genuine. I contacted, in fact, in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, the University of Portland, where they have a specialist department specializing in Churchill's bibliography. A list is kept, an index, a computer index of all Winston Churchill's works, and they wrote to me saying regretfully, yes, Winston Churchill had written that appalling article back in 1920. This is the kind of thing I shall be telling you in a minute or two, because later on we find that Winston Churchill, for some mysterious reason, switched his aim. In the middle of the 1930s, he suddenly became, from being a dedicated anti-Zionist, he became what he described in a private letter to Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, one of the world's foremost secret Zionists, a closet Zionist. I'm quoting his actual letter because the Israeli government were good enough to give me complete and restricted access to the private papers of Chaim Weizmann in the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot in Israel for my Winston Churchill biography. You can understand that as I've been able to use papers like that, I'm running up into problems with the Churchill biography now. We're going to find that it's going to be very difficult for me to publish my Churchill biography anywhere in the world. My Hitler biography, on which I dedicated 10 years of my life from 1964 to 1974, was published initially without problems all the way around the world, and I'm glad to say that that biography is gradually becoming the standard work because it is based entirely on original documents. And yet, the Churchill biography, one publisher after another, is tearing up the contract now that they've read the manuscript. Doubleday in the United States has torn up the contract and demanded that I repay $100,000 because, quote unquote, Mr. Irving, you have found out things in your book about Winston Churchill that the American public would prefer not to be told. And the same in Britain, and the same in France, and the same in Germany. They've torn up the contracts. In Germany, fortunately, one of the biggest, boldest, bravest publishing houses, a left-wing liberal publishing house, has come forward and has offered now to take over that manuscript and to publish it. In the English-speaking world, we're going to publish it ourselves, you and me. I have found capital in Australia and the United States, people who are raising £150,000 to capitalise the publication of my book in the original unexpurgated form, because as I say in German, I say it in English, es gibt nur die eine Wahrheit, die totale Wahrheit, that's my slogan in German. There's only one truth, and that is total truth. You've got to publish the truth, whether you like it or not. Let me give you an example of that. I'll give you an example of that. Winston Churchill writing his famous 6-volume history of the war. A magnificent literary work, if I may say so. I hope that when I'm as old as Churchill, I'm still able to pour out volumes of that complexity and that magisterial quality. Winston Churchill, he wanted to publish a certain piece of evidence that he had about where the Germans got their money, where Adolf Hitler got his money in the rise to power. In that final desperate, headlong rush to the Nazi revolution in 1933, when the Germans, the Nazi party, were almost on the point of bankruptcy, somebody put up the money for Adolf Hitler in order to ensure that he came into power. Winston Churchill knew the answer, because Winston Churchill was privately told this in a letter dated August 28, 1937, by Dr. Heinrich Brüning. Dr. Heinrich Brüning, I should tell you, those who don't know, was Adolf Hitler's predecessor as Chancellor in Germany. With a short interim government, Brüning had been the long-term German Chancellor. Hitler had overthrown him. The Nazi revolution had swept Brüning aside. Brüning, being the Prime Minister of Germany, the Chancellor, of course, knew who had financed Hitler because his secret service, his wiretapping agencies had been listening to Hitler's telephone conversations and opening his mail. They knew where the money came from. And Brüning, when he fled to England after Hitler came to power, told Winston Churchill privately in a letter, August 28, 1937, and Churchill wanted to quote that letter in his post-war memoirs, the big 6-volume book. And Churchill's memoirs, as you know, were published by the Life magazine, serialized by Life in 1948, 49, 50, and that is why among the private papers of Life magazine's chief editor I found the letters, the ones that I'm going to quote to you now, because you won't find them in the Churchill archives for the simple reason that if you are writing about Churchill, even if your name is William Manchester, which it isn't, thank God, you will not be given access to the private papers of Churchill. The Churchill family has put their hand on those papers and will not allow them to be seen by anybody, except for one authorized biographer, Martin Gilbert, a dedicated Zionist who is partly financed by the Jaffa Foundation, as he writes in the introduction to his Churchill biographies. So we can't get access to the Churchill papers. We've got to go everywhere else, which is what I do. I go all the way around the world working in these archives, like, as I mentioned, the archives of Life magazine in the United States. And there I found this letter, Churchill writing to Brüning saying, in August 1937, you wrote me a letter which I want to quote in my memoirs about who paid Hitler in 1933 and the years up to the Nazi revolution. And Brüning wrote back to him. Here's the letter dated February the 7th, 1948, from the private files of the chief editor of Life magazine. Never published, and you're hearing it for the first time now. Brüning said he couldn't give Churchill permission to quote that letter because it was too painful, in view of everything that happened in Germany during the Third Reich, in view, of course, of the Holocaust, to have to admit this. He says, I didn't then, and do not even today, for understandable reasons, wish to reveal that from October 1928, the two largest regular contributors to the Nazi Party were the general managers of two of the largest Berlin banks, both of the Jewish faith, and one of them the leader of Zionism in Germany. Now, I don't know whether Brüning is a reliable source, and let me make that quite plain. Brüning was admittedly the Chancellor of Germany before Hitler. He had all the Secret Service methods of surveillance at his fingertips. He could find out things like this. So he was in a position to know what he's writing about, which is an important criterion on documents. As a historian, and I was taught this by Trevor Roper himself in England, as a historian, when you're looking at a document, you've got to ask yourself three important questions. Why has that document been written? What purpose? Because it may be a document written for spurious purposes, like, for example, a document being written in order to cover up a certain truth. Is the document genuine? Also an important question, because there are a lot of fake documents floating around, but I know how to detect them. I've got a lot of comparisons, I've got a lot of expertise in detecting fakes. I've been flooded with fakes over the last 20 years, and I don't think I've fallen victim of a single one, because you can always, if the worst comes to the worst, I've got a very good laboratory which I rely on in the City of London, who work for the insurance industry, Hayner and Cox Limited, and they carry out the forensic tests on the paper, the black light tests, the ink, the type of typewriter used and so on, and they can tell me if a document has been faked or not. That's the second question, is the document fake? And the third important question is the man who wrote the document in a position to know what he's purporting to write about? A very important criterion. It's no use having the private diary of a street sweeper in Berlin if you want to find out what's going on in the Chancellor in the Wilhelmstrasse. You need to have a document written by somebody in a position to know. And this document, of course, by Brüning, the letter by Brüning to Churchill, is by a man technically in a position to know. He wrote that, and he said he didn't want to reveal in 1947 that, unfortunately, the money which had brought Hitler into power was paid by these two Berlin banks and their general managers, about which he made that remark, which, if I was to make it, of course, would be considered deeply objectionable. I'm not making it. Let me emphasize that. It's being made by Dr. Heinrich Brüning himself, who died only a few years ago. You see the problems we're up against when we look at the history of the Second World War. And it's a problem which we can learn from now, because if we were being duped at the time about the leaders in the Second World War, about your own Prime Minister Mackenzie King, about the Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies, about Roosevelt, about Churchill, about Hitler and Stalin, if we were being duped at the time, and if we were being successfully lied to, and if these lies have been told to us so well that they are still now believed, even today, 50 years later, aren't we required to ask ourselves certain questions about major issues of political importance which are being turned out to us now by those modern historians, the journalists, the newspaper trade, the media men, and ask ourselves, isn't this a new embryo lie in the creation? And of course it is, and I'm going to tell you at the end of this talk certain episodes which make me convinced that we are being lied to. We're being lied to about Libya, we're being lied to about South Africa. But first of all, let me, so to speak, establish my credentials as somebody capable of detecting long-term lies. How do these lies come into existence? Well, the answer is lies are particularly generated in wartime, because you can only persuade the soldiers to fight in wartime by telling them lies, because man's natural instinct isn't to go around hunting and killing. Man's natural instinct nowadays is to sit in front of the telly at home, or whatever the 1940s equivalent of that was. So to get him to go out and fight, as Mrs. Thatcher did at the time of the Falklands crisis, you've got to start the propaganda machinery rolling, and the propaganda flywheel begins to spin. And this propaganda flywheel is given more and more impetus as the war gets bigger and the cost gets larger, and you have to justify what you're doing. And the propaganda flywheel in World War II was set in motion by Winston Churchill, who was the world's greatest liar, and I use that in the sense of the utmost admiration. He was the world's, in fact, he himself said, the truth is so precious, it has to be protected in a bodyguard of lies. He said that to Mackenzie King on September the 17th, 1944. If you go to your archives here in Ottawa, you'll find it in the Mackenzie King original diary. The truth is so precious. And so the lies are churned out. And the trouble is that when the war ends, nobody has an interest in putting his hand on that flywheel and stopping it. So the wheel continues to spin, and is still spinning now of its own momentum 40 or 50 years later. And the same old lies are being turned out, because who can profit from putting his hand on that flywheel and stopping it? One thing is quite certain, you'll get burnt if you do, and so on balance you don't. Certainly the politicians don't. Certainly the people who fought the war don't. The only people who should do it is the historian, because as Winston Churchill himself rightly said, the historian's job is to find out what happened and why. What happened and why. And there's no reason why you shouldn't find it out, because when you've won a war, you get access to all the enemy's records, all the people are available, and you can genuinely find out what happened and why. But you're wasting your time if you look in the official records, the official histories. I can give you 2 or 3 examples of why you shouldn't look in the British official histories of what happened and why. You won't find it. If you look in the entire British histories of the Second World War, for example, you won't find a single reference to Ultra, to the code-breaking secret, the fact that we were winning the war because we were reading almost all the German military and diplomatic messages throughout the war. And the reason why is because after the war, the chiefs of staff and the cabinet in Britain united with the cabinets of the governments all the way around the world and agreed that no official historians would even be told about Ultra. And so those official historians are virtually useless. You can't rely on their works. That's just one little example of why we can't rely on the official historians. I'll give you another example. Captain Stephen Roskill, our naval historian in Britain, he quotes a particular diary entry on April 11th, 1940, of Captain Ralph Edwards, director of the Operations Division in the Admiralty in Britain, referring to the fact that his First Lord, which is Winston Churchill at that time, the First Lord of the Admiralty, has come to that evening's board meeting at the Admiralty very tired. Now, that's the actual quotation which the Captain Stephen Roskill puts in the official naval history. I've seen the original diary, ladies and gentlemen, and in handwritten, in ink, Captain Edwards has written, "Winston arrived at this evening's board meeting half tight." So that is completely different, and I'm not just quoting that to you because it's a humorous example. A humorous example, it would be humorous if he was just drunk. People who are drunk are sometimes jolly to look at. They're rather droll to behold. Winston Churchill was droll, but it was not humorous for the British or the British Empire because he attended Admiralty meetings, he attended cabinet meetings and defence meetings right through the Second World War in a state of intoxication. And this has been concealed and covered up. It has not been written about. It has been deliberately camouflaged by the official historians because it is such a shameful fact that they daren't admit it. And I was speaking in South Africa only last month in September. In Pretoria, I think it was, and one of the radio journalists there sneered at me and said, "How can David Irving say, as he said in a speech yesterday in Durban, I understand, that Winston Churchill attended his cabinet meetings in a state of drunkenness? If this was true, why don't we find it in the diaries of people like General Allen Book, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, which have been published and are long available to the historians?" And the answer is because General Allen Book didn't dare to quote from his diaries, which I have. Allen Book's original handwritten diaries, little leather-bound volumes, locked with a lock and key like a Victorian lady's diaries, you remember, locked by a little metal strap and key so you can't open them. Allen Book's original diaries are in the University of London, in the Strand, in the King's College. You can read them there if you've got the energy. Nobody does because they prefer the printed volumes. If you look in the original handwritten volumes, you see that Allen Book has referred to Churchill's drunkenness in cabinet meetings again and again and again until he no longer bothers to say it. Rather like the famous episode, you remember, the ship's captain who says to his mate, "If you write down in the ship's log one more time that I was drunk on duty this evening, I'll have you keel-hauled." And the ship's mate the next day writes in his ship's log, "Today the captain was sober," which has precisely the same effect. And Allen Book, of course, no longer bothers to write it in his diary after a time. He occasionally refers to it when it is a matter of supreme moment. I'll give you another example. Admiral Cunningham, the first Sea Lord in Britain, Admiral Sir Andrew B. Cunningham, a fine old red-eyed English sea dog, an extraordinary man. He kept a handwritten diary which is in the British Museum at this moment. You can go and read it if you've got the energy. There's no restrictions, but people don't go to read it. Now, I'll explain why in a minute. He writes repeatedly in his diary about Churchill attending cabinet meetings in a state of tired emotionability, as I suppose Private Eye would say, completely drunk, in other words, intoxicated. Now, I'll only mention one example, and that's on July the 6th, 1944. July the 6th, 1944, he says Churchill attended the cabinet meeting in a state of intoxication. He talked and talked from 10 p.m. until 2 in the morning, 4 hours, and he hardly let anybody get a word in edgeways. And it's only of interest because it shows that it was by no means humorous or funny or ridiculous or droll when Churchill was drunk, because on that day he took this decision, which I have here, signed by Churchill, July the 6th, 1944. You can see his initials and date on the end. This is the day that Churchill took this decision to start poison gas warfare. Although we had signed the protocols at Geneva, the Geneva Gas Convention, we would never ever use poison gas, Churchill decided to commit a war crime. He was going to have poison gas bombs dropped on all the biggest German cities immediately, and he ordered the General Staff, the Air Staff, to prepare it forthwith. To commit a war crime. We had the bombs ready, the mustard gas and all the other poison gases. We had tens of thousands of bombs filled, and we had 2 million bombs filled with anthrax germs. Also, a little-known fact, a friend of mine in the BBC found this out, Robert Harris. He wrote an article about it, and of course you can imagine the vitriol which was poured on him for having revealed this little fact, that Churchill was wanting to drop 2 million anthrax bombs on Germany. Although anthrax, as you know from a farming community, any of you, is a deadly killer. A deadly killer of livestock, of human beings. We tried one anthrax bomb on one island off the Scottish coast during the war just to see if it worked. And that island is still uninhabitable today, ladies and gentlemen. It is a criminal offence to go anywhere near that island. It is a lethal offence, of course, to put your foot on that island because you are dead within a short space of time. That's the effect of anthrax. Churchill had 2 million filled. He wanted to drop them beginning with July 1944 because 2 reasons. He couldn't break out of the bridgehead in Normandy. The Normandy bridgehead was becoming a millstone round the British neck. Rommel was putting up a colossal fight there, and we couldn't break out, so he wanted to use it to destroy the German morale. And also because the German flying bomb bombardment had begun against England, the V-1s, the Doodlebugs, these dreadful pilotless bombs were being fired at London. I know they were very unpleasant. They went right overhead every night, every half hour. You couldn't sleep. They made the most awful noise, psychologically speaking, a weapon of the most infamous terror. And Churchill wanted to hit back against this revenge weapon of the Germans, poison gas. I want you to think very seriously, he wrote on this drunken evening, I want you to think very seriously over this question of poison gas. It's absurd to consider morality because, of course, the whole argument had been about whether we're going to allow ourselves to commit a war crime or not. It's absurd to consider morality on this topic when everybody used it in the last war without a word of complaint from the moralists or the church. On the other hand, in the last war, the bombing of open cities was regarded as forbidden. Now everybody does it as a matter of course. It's simply a question of fashion changing as she does between long and short skirts for women. I don't think you often hear that quoted in your newspapers over here when we always regard with fond admiration and nostalgia the record of Winston Churchill. I want a cold-blooded calculation made as to how it would pay us to use poison gas. I only mention this example because it gives us a direct yardstick with which to compare Hitler and Churchill. On other matters, of course, you have no yardstick because they're two completely different worlds and mentalities. But on this particular one, poison gas, you've got one yardstick. And I can tell you, you can take it from me, I've read the entire German documentation for 10 years. All the way through the German files, Adolf Hitler has flatly and emphatically forbidden and embargoed anywhere the use of poison gas. It's there, the actual document signed by Hitler, the references in the files of the German High Command, the verbatim references by him and the shorthand records of his meetings, the shorthand records of meetings in the German Air Ministry. The Führer has absolutely forbidden the use of poison gas. The enemy is to use it first and then we will retaliate with ours. The reason being, the reason that makes this yardstick so extraordinary is that if Churchill had done what he was threatening and dropped the poison gas on German cities, the Germans would have won the war because the Germans had not just poison gases like mustard, the Germans had nerve gases. At this time, in 1944, they already had stockpiles of 30,000 tons of nerve gases. Sarin and Taboon, the famous nerve gases being used even now by the Russians in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Angola and elsewhere where the Russian troops are fighting. The nerve gases Sarin and Taboon, Hitler already had stockpiles of 30,000 tons, and nobody found out till the war was over, which is just as well because if Hitler had ever used it in Normandy, fighting the Allied, the American, the French, the British troops in Normandy, the Canadians as well, it would have been the end of the bridgehead because we didn't have a gas mask. We had no gas mask which would have stopped the German nerve gases. It would have been the end of the bridgehead. And isn't it strange that Adolf Hitler, the devil incarnate, had the means whereby he could have secured an immediate strategic advantage which would have turned the war because he would have pulled the 9 or 10 panzer divisions out of Normandy and sent them to the Russian front, and with those high-grade divisions he would have wiped the floor with the Russians and ended the war by Christmas 1944. But he had put his name on a piece of paper, the Geneva Gas Protocol, saying that he would never use gas first because it would be a war crime. I'm only giving you this one example at this stage. I shall feed more to you later on. But you've got to ask yourself why it is that I, David Irving, come along and say this to you, and why my front door is sledgehammered and my printing works are set on fire, and why I'm subjected to all kinds of psychological and other terror, and why your own academic historians don't do it. Well, the answer is, it lies in the nature of things, ladies and gentlemen. There's a difference between historians. Es gibt Zotter und Zotter, as the Swabians say. There's these and there's those. There's the academic historians like them, and there's the capitalist historians like myself. And I use the word capitalist in an entirely neutral sense. Capitalist in as much as I have to make a living out of writing history, which means I have to have my books continually published, which means I can't afford to make mistakes. If anybody can come along and say, David Irving, you've got egg all over your face, now we've got you, we can trip you up this time, you've fallen for a phony document, or you've overreached yourself, or you really can't substantiate this allegation or hypothesis, I'm finished. The next time, or at the very latest, the time after that, the publishers will say, David Irving, I'm afraid your books are unreliable, we can't afford to publish you. Of course, they're saying that now, but for a different reason. They're saying it because I found out the things that will get them, their own publishers, like Doubleday, a bad name with the American marketers, and of course with their own commercial interests in the United States. My books are written with immense capital investment. That means I do research all the way around the world. I write in the Churchill biography, I looked in the Menzies diaries down in Canberra, I looked at the Smuts papers in Pretoria, I looked at the Mackenzie King papers here in Ottawa, I looked in all the federal archives and all the presidential archives in the United States. I spent 10 years writing it. I've invested perhaps 80 or 90,000 pounds in the research alone, in the confident belief that when the book is sold, A, it will go down in history as the reliable standard work, and B, it will probably on balance make back enough money, but even if it doesn't earn enough money back, I don't really mind, because in the meantime I write other books like Rommel, which make enough money to pay for the big, really politically serious books. So I do the kind of research that, and I don't hold this against the academic historians, I do the kind of research they can't afford. They haven't got the time, they haven't got the money, and of course they haven't got the guts. They haven't got the guts to write the truth, and they haven't got the guts to find a publisher who will publish it even if they do write the truth. And this is my most serious allegation against the academic body of historians, that they are not prepared to risk the chance they're on. And this, of course, is a process that they've been involved in ever since they arrived at university, because those of you who've been to university will recognize what I'm about to say. You arrive at university with all the youthful idealism and eagerness of the freshman, and the first thing that's thrust into your hands is the set list. A list of set books to read. You're given a list of set books to read by your professor or by your tutor on your particular subject, church history, medieval history, whatever it is. And the set books you read from the left to the right, and when you've read the set books, of course, you know how to think. And you begin that insidious process which we can call self-censorship. Nobody's telling you what to write, but a little voice inside you says, write like that because you'll get good marks. And a little voice also tells you over the next few weeks, if you haven't learned it at the beginning, you'd better write that way because that's the way the professor or your tutor wants you to think. And so this little process of set book censorship begins. It's a rut that gets deeper and deeper. The student gets deeper and deeper into this rut over his 3 or 4 year course until finally he emerges at the end convinced he's learned how to research history and he's learned a great deal about his particular subject. But as the rut has got deeper, of course, he can no longer see out over the edges laterally and convince himself that there's no other possible explanation for some of the great mysteries of past or present or recent history. And of course there are other solutions the whole time. I shall offer other solutions to you in a minute about these great mysteries. But let us look at the professors. Why do they do that? Why are they also following along in the same rut, this self-perpetuating rut along which history has advanced? And the answer is, of course, the professors have learned the simple truth that no professor has yet been sacked for swimming with the stream. And so they continue to swim along with the stream because they read the newspapers like everybody else. They see on television what happens to somebody who stands up and disbelieves. The disbelievers, whether they say that the earth is not flat or whatever they say, the disbelievers have a rougher ride than the believers. And so, on balance, people prefer to believe. The stream is self-perpetuating. And we've seen in our own country here in Canada what happens to the disbelievers. Sometimes a very rough and harsh fate indeed, threats of deportation, arrest, eviction from their job, hounding, harassing and terrorization that goes on when people begin to disbelieve in public. So you begin to understand why the writing of history is a self-perpetuating job. The first professor comes along, and I've told this to you before, but I'll tell it again because it can't be repeated often enough. The first professor comes along and writes some little tiny hypothesis. He ventures this hypothesis, which he half thinks to himself may be untrue, but he ventures it, he flies a balloon. And this balloon becomes bigger and bigger until it becomes a gigantic Goodyear blimp floating around with enough people quoting it and backing it up with enough hot air that this blimp floats around. It's got its own life. This balloon, these theories, these hypotheses, they have their own kind of charmed existence of their own. They're no longer attached to the ground. They're not tethered to any documents or substantial evidence at all. They survive because enough people believe them to be true. It's rather like the fairy in Peter Pan. You remember? Do you believe in fairies? and I'm using fair in the old-fashioned sense, not in the sense of gay or whatever. Do you believe, we all have to believe, unfortunately, in the other kind of fairy. Do you believe in fairies? The whole audience roars yes, and then the fairies' light comes on again. And so it is with the historians. He floats this little hypothesis. Do you believe this hypothesis? The entire body of academic historians says, yes, I believe, I believe. And so this hypothesis becomes invulnerable, unchallengeable. Professor Martin Broschardt in Munich, the famous Nazi-hunting historian in Germany, Professor Martin Broschardt in Munich, he writes a tiny hypothesis about something, about Auschwitz, about the Holocaust, or whatever. He's quoted by Professor Eberhard Jekyll, a sanguine, serious, somber-looking, pipe-smoking historian in Stuttgart. Professor Hilgruber in Cologne quotes Jekyll, Professor Jacobsen in Bonn quotes Hilgruber, and so it goes on. They're all quoting each other. 4 professors all saying the same thing. It must be true. And if you're a historian, you know that you've got to be quoted by the other professors, otherwise you are not writing the truth. And so they all go around this jolly club, all quoting each other. It's a kind of philosophical context, a concept as a historian. The kind of philosophical concept, unless you're being quoted by other historians, you don't exist. You remember, like that Immanuel Kant, like the tree in the forest, which doesn't exist because you didn't hear it fall. If you're a historian who's not being quoted by anybody else, you don't really exist. And so they all go around apprehensively quoting each other in the knowledge that they too will be quoted in turn, and so they begin to exist as historians. Broschardt has blown the initial... you've got 4 historians all saying the same thing. 5 historians, 10 historians, all quoting each other, 20 historians. It must be true. If 20 people say the same thing, it's got to be true. And so history begins to take off like that Goodyear blimp. It takes off and it leads an existence of its own. 20 dogs, 20 historians, 20 dogs, all chasing around in a circle, sniffing each other's tail. And you've got this circle of historians all spinning around and round and round, generating an impression of furious, frantic activity. But of course they're just spinning around and round in the same place and not making any progress. They're not making any progress in the sense of historical research. They're all standing in the same place. Or put it another way, Professor Martin Broschardt has blown that initial little balloon, the little soap bubble that starts it all off about the Holocaust or whatever. And along comes Jekyll and puts hot air in, and Jacobsen puts more hot air in, and Hilgruber puffs it bigger, and the balloon gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the soap bubble gets bigger and begins to shimmer and wobble and become unstable, and they get apprehensive that at any moment some idiot, some appalling, incorrigible, heretical idiot may come along and prick that soap bubble. And I am that prick. Again and again I come along with the documents and I challenge them to prove me wrong. And they can't prove me wrong because I had the documents on my side. I've spoken to big audiences everywhere around the world, especially in Germany over the last year, and everywhere I go, the only way they can smash me is by literally smashing up my meetings. I spoke in Germany, for example, 7 times in August, just before I set off for South Africa, and of those 7 meetings, 3 were cancelled, rained out by the communists, the halls barricaded, riot police couldn't get the audience in. The audiences which were to take my audience to the alternative hall, which we rented, of course, we're not fools. The audiences found that the coaches had been set on fire, the tyres slashed. This is the battle for the freedom of speech in Germany. The 4 weeks I spent in South Africa were peaceful compared with that. And I'll tell you about that later on. The 20,000 people I spoke to there, not the slightest trouble. I travelled from coast to coast, from northern frontier to the southernmost tip of the African continent, and I saw not the slightest sign of trouble. Not in the white towns, not in the black townships, nowhere. I'm telling you that because for 4 weeks I expected to see something. You don't even see the second-order signs of trouble in South Africa, like police stand. I see more signs of trouble in the streets around the halls where I'm due to speak in Germany than I ever saw in the whole of South Africa in 4 weeks travelling over the whole country. That is the truth. And of course you're all being deceived about that. And I'm going to come back at the end of my talk and tell you about that. You see, I told you about Hitler and I told you about Churchill. Why did we have to lie so much during the Second World War? The answer is that we British, in fighting the Second World War, bankrupted the Second World War, bankrupted Britain and the British Empire. We had no money left in 1940 even. By December 1940, there wasn't a bean in the British bank, and we still kept on fighting. In fact, Roosevelt sent an American battleship to Simonstown Naval Base in South Africa to pick up our last remaining gold. He found out that we had 28 million pounds of British gold still in South Africa, and Roosevelt sent an American warship to pick up our last money. A most humiliating episode in the entire history of the British Empire, but it was symbolic somehow of the decline and fall over which Winston Churchill personally presided. And if you say, but he had no alternative because we were fighting a desperate war, the answer is, what were we fighting for? And if I ask you that question, you're going to come up with 2 or 3 or 4 different reasons. The first reason was, well, we were fighting for Poland. Well, that's an old-fashioned version, of course. It was true in 1939 that we were fighting for Poland, and very right that we should do so because we did give our word. But Poland vanished by the end of 1939. It vanished without trace, invaded not only by the Nazis, but by our friends, the Soviet Union. From 1939 onwards, nobody is talking anymore about saving Poland. In fact, in 1945, Poland was far worse off than it had been at the end of 1939. And there was no talk of Britain any longer continuing the war on Poland's behalf. When Churchill came to power, the war aim became magically changed. We were fighting not because of Poland, that was no longer mentioned. We were fighting to protect the British Empire. And of course, in December 1941, that war aim was abandoned because you're not going to get Roosevelt to fight with the Americans on behalf of the British Empire. So mysteriously, the aim was changed. We were now fighting in order to defeat the devil incarnate. And when you are fighting Beelzebub, when you're fighting the Satan, when you're fighting the devil, of course you have to commit yourself. You have to invest every single ounce of strength you've got, even if it means destroying your own empire, killing millions of... If the war had ended in June 1940, ladies and gentlemen, as I maintain it should, and I'll explain why in a minute, if we had got out of the war in June 1940, as we could have done, on the most generous terms, if the war had ended in June 1940, 20, 30 million people would not have been killed who were killed in the remaining 5 years of the war. All Europe's cities which were damaged and bombed and blasted and burned and devastated and ruined in the ensuing 5 years of war would not have been damaged. And of course, the Holocaust wouldn't have happened, whatever it was. I'm not going to go into what the Holocaust was or wasn't because I'm not an expert on that, but I can tell you that whatever it was or wasn't, it wouldn't have happened if the war had ended in June 1940. But Winston Churchill wanted the war to continue. Winston Churchill wanted the war to continue, and I'll explain why in a second, and so he fought on for another 5 years, getting deeper and deeper and deeper into debt in the process, until finally he crawled from the courtroom of history on his hands and knees, but with his hand up and saying, "We have won. We have won," when in fact the truth was that the British had lost. If you want to look for the people who were responsible for the Holocaust, and I give this advice to Mr. Simon Wiesenthal himself, you don't have to look further than the bronze statue in Westminster in Parliament Square where Winston Churchill is standing at this moment, because he bears at least a partial share of the blame for the tragedy that befell the Jews in Europe, because Churchill fought the war 5 years longer than was necessary and provided the smokescreen behind which the tragedy could occur. But of course people don't like to think that. That is lateral thinking. That is climbing out of the rut. You will not get good marks on your term paper if you write things like that. And that's why you sit here to hear this rather than read the books of the academic historians. Because the academic historians don't do the research. They can't think for themselves. William Manchester, even, when he writes a book about Churchill as he is at this moment, he goes to a bookshop and he buys 20 books about Churchill and he writes number 21. John Toland, when he writes about Hitler, he can't read German. John Toland borrows 30 books about Hitler and writes book 31. You won't find new thoughts there. They're all just quoting each other. Why do I say that we could have got out of the war in June 1940? People are going to say, and I'm sure fewer people in this room than outside in the street in Toronto would say, "Irving, how can you spout such rubbish and nonsense and heresy, getting out of the war in June 1940 after Britain's streets were a sea of flames, after you were fighting the devil incarnate? You had to do it. There was no choice. The British Empire was at stake." Well, the answer is Britain's streets weren't a sea of flames. Hitler had, in fact, flatly forbidden any kind of air raids on Britain. There were no bombing raids on British towns. London was completely embargoed until the summer of 1940. But of course history now is viewed differently through the lenses of the television media of the world. Not one bomb fell on a British town, civilian target, until August 1940, until in fact September the 6th, 1940, when the first air raids took place on London in retaliation for 8 raids by Churchill on Berlin. That is the first truth. The second truth, the ugliest truth of all, is, as we find in the archives when we read them, that nowhere is there the slightest evidence that Adolf Hitler threatened Britain or the British Empire. Quite the contrary. He made a peace offer to the British in June 1940. Again in July, he had been hinting at it ever since the 1930s, and he repeated this peace offer right through until 1941, 1942. Rudolf Hess, who flew to Scotland in 1941, brought the peace offer in his pocket, which is why Hess is to this day still in prison, 92 years old in Spandau, incommunicado, 25 years in solitary confinement. Not allowed to speak to anybody, allowed to visit once a month from his son to talk about family matters, forbidden to talk about politics, because Hess knows the truth about the peace offer which we turned down in 1940. The peace offer to the British Empire, which Hitler made in June 1940, was as follows: "I will withdraw all German forces from everywhere in Europe, except for the provinces which had always been German and which had been taken away from Germany at the end of the First World War." He didn't want any part of Poland or Czechoslovakia or Norway or France, except what had always been German. It was the great German dream. And as for France and Britain, although we had damaged Germany a great deal with our declaration of war and the hostilities since then, he offered to the British in this peace offer, which is in the British files, if you go to the archives now, and it's in the German files, of course, he offered to the British the following terms. I have the greatest admiration for Britain and the British Empire. I want the British Empire to survive in perpetuity and grow larger and larger. If the British Empire should at any time in my lifetime, Hitler's lifetime, be threatened by any outside force, including the Japanese, the Russians, the Soviet Union, who were Hitler's own allies, I guarantee that I will provide to the British whatever forces they may ask for to help to throw these aggressors out of the British Empire. That man was our enemy. This was the man we were taught to defend our empire from. And yet we read the secret American papers and we see Roosevelt in his cabinet meetings talking to his cabinet members, people like the Secretary of the Interior, Henry F. Ickes, and saying, my great ambition in life is to see the destruction of the British Empire, beginning with India. That man was our ally. Now it begins to get rather confused, doesn't it? When you see why we were fighting the one and taking the alliance of the other, why we were selling up the empire in order to provide the money to buy the guns, the tanks, the ships, the bombs, the bullets, the gallons of gasoline from the Americans, because believe me, they didn't give us one single bullet or gallon of gasoline except that we paid up front for it in cash or kind. I mentioned the battleship to you that Roosevelt sent down to Simonstown to pick up our last cash reserves. When that money ran out, Roosevelt sent Henry Morgenthau's treasury agents around the British bank accounts in Wall Street and elsewhere around the world, sniffing and snooping and snuffling to find out where Britain still had a few odd coppers left. Because, as he told his own cabinet, I'm going to get every penny out of the British that I can. This was in the early part of 1941. All this altruistic idealism that we're told about now, how the Americans saved civilization and liberty and freedom, what Churchill himself called this unsordid act, was in fact the most sordid act that we, from the British standpoint, can imagine in history. Roosevelt made us give up everything we had before he came to help us. He made us buy the garden hose to put out the famous fire that he talked about in Native speeches. When he found out that we had no money left, he then said to Henry Morgenthau, the British now have to liquidate every asset they have. And it started off with the sale of the Viscose Corporation in 1941, owned by the British in the United States, a big chemical combine, the Viscose Corporation, worth nearly £100 million, knocked down for £39 million to the Morgan Bank in New York, an American bank. They bought it dirt cheap. And so it went on. The Venezuelan railroads, the oil fields, the coal mines, everything that the British Empire had established and built up and created by investment and hard work, blood, sweat and toil, if you like, overseas in the previous 300 or 400 years, we had to sell off in order to raise the funds. And the Americans provided the funds. Weren't they kind? You know how it is with a neighbour. You know how it is with a neighbour down the street. Everyone hears he's on hard times. Bankruptcy staring him in the face, but just before he's bankrupted, all the friends and neighbours club round and help him. And one of the neighbours offers him $50 for his Steinway grand piano. And another neighbour offers him $10 for his colour stereo TV, and so it goes on. They all help him. And so the Americans helped us British. They helped us out of our empire in the 1941-1942 period, until finally we had no assets left, and then Lend-Lease began. We sunk deeper and deeper into debt in World War II, until finally, at the end of the war, we had over £1,100 million of debts to the Americans. Completely out of depth in hoc in Britain. And the British never found out. And the reason why is because Churchill lied to the British. He never told us that he had sunk us into bankruptcy by fighting the Second World War for that 5 years after Hitler's peace offer. The 5 useless years of war. In fact, when Henry Morgenthau visited him on August the 4th, 1944, for lunch, as I know, because I got Churchill's appointment book, his desk calendar, I rented it for £5,000 from the man who stole it from him, his bodyguard. When this Morgenthau visited him on August the 4th, 1944, Morgenthau says to him, Mr. Prime Minister, how are you planning to break it to the British people that, in fact, they are complete flat broke? And Churchill said, as we know from Morgenthau's own private diary, Churchill said, that is a doleful task that I propose to leave to my successor. So he left it to his successor, Clement Attlee, and Clement Attlee, of course, saw no reason at all to tell the British. I told you about the flywheel that keeps on spinning. Nobody has an interest in stopping that flywheel, and so it continues to spin. Clement Attlee never. The British still haven't found out they lost the empire in World War II. So Churchill and Roosevelt meeting on a battleship here in Canadian waters in August 1941. Incidentally, I might mention that not even your own Prime Minister Mackenzie King knew they were meeting there in Canadian waters. It was kept secret from him by Mr. Churchill. Churchill didn't believe in consulting the Empire Prime Ministers even when he was selling the empire down the river. On that day, Roosevelt and Churchill signed the deal that, in fact, led to the dissolution of the Ottawa Agreement, imperial preference, the foundation on which the empire was built up as a trading concern. The empire vanished. It's vanished over the... This is what particularly upsets me. When I was born in 1938, the empire was a going concern, expanding a great force, as Hitler himself said, for world peace and civilization. And yet it suddenly vanished. And it vanished because of the Winston Churchills and the Harold Macmillans of this world. It vanished, and the British still haven't found out. If you go to Britain now, as I'm sure some of you occasionally do, or if you meet the English like myself, you will see in our eye the glint of imperial arrogance, the belief that we still have an empire somewhere out there. And some of your prime ministers, some of your politicians pander to this British belief. You have that flag. You had that flag until recently. You have your royal this and your crown that. And you help to pander to the British belief that the empire is still out there somewhere. The British have never realised that the empire is gone. It's mislaid. We're going to get it back. Rather like an old English woman who's gone shopping in Oxford Street and lost her shopping. She's put her shopping bags down with plastic bags with names like Marks and Spencers and Harrods and Selfridges, and she's left it on the number 73 bus, and this bus is cruising up and down Oxford Street at this moment, in perpetuity, and she's only got to go in due course to the Lost Property Office, and we've only got to go to the Lost Empire Office, and they'll give it all back to us. And the proof that the empire is out there, is that the tourists from the British Empire, those nice gentlemen with pigmentation problems, those tourists from the British Empire are visiting us at this moment. Admittedly, they're not as polite and as well-mannered as we English. We English have a certain gentility about us. It isn't very genteel to throw petrol bombs at our nice English policemen, but that, of course, just confirms us. We put up with it because it is the proof that the empire is still out there. Of course, it's hooey. We lost the empire because we fought a war that had become stupid from 1940 onwards. And if you people say, and if the people outside in the street say, David Irving, how can you spout this heresy about making peace in 1940 with that arch-devil, Adolf Hitler? Then the answer is, it isn't just David Irving who's saying we could have made peace on June the 23rd, 1940. Winston Churchill said it. Winston Churchill, in his secret cabinet meeting on June the 23rd, 1940, actually said to his war cabinet, the inner cabinet, I think we would be wrong not to accept the peace offer which Mr. Hitler has made to us, provided that we can secure the necessary guarantees of sovereignty for the empire and the Commonwealth countries. I can see you're hushed by that, because now you're realizing I'm not just spouting propaganda at you. If Churchill himself said this on June the 23rd, 1940, why in God's name didn't he go ahead and do the morally courageous thing, which was to realize that the war was a lost concern, and that by fighting it any longer we couldn't help Poland, but we would damage the British Empire, which on balance was far more important for the future of the world than what happened to Poland, which really was no concern of ours. And why, you may ask, did Churchill not continue and make peace on that day or the next? Well, the answer is that over the next 2 or 3 days you find Churchill considering doing a peace deal with Hitler, with that man, again on June the 23rd, June the 26th, and again on a few days in July. But on each occasion, of course, he's gone home to his bunker in Downing Street under 17 feet of concrete. He's gone home to his bunker and he's slapped himself on the head and he's said to himself, my God, what am I saying? I must be out of my mind. If we make peace with Hitler tomorrow, then I am finished the day after. Winston Churchill would never have been retained as Prime Minister by the British, and Winston Churchill in June 1940 was a man who had only disasters to his name. The Dardanelles conflict, Gallipoli, my father fought in Gallipoli aboard a British Navy battleship, that fiasco, the Chanak crisis of 1927, the Norway fiasco of 1940, in which Churchill himself, as First Lord of the Admiralty, was responsible by his bungling, which I won't describe here, but by his immense bungling. Drunken meetings of the Admiralty will have played their part. Churchill was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of British and French and Polish troops in the Narvik campaign of 1940. And, of course, by June 1940, he had seen France completely overrun in a few weeks by Hitler, and he himself had masterminded the bungling, disgraceful debacle of Dunkirk. And I could justify those adjectives too, but of course we're running out of time. The war would still see further fiascos at Churchill's hand. In 1941, he masterminded the Tobruk defeat, he masterminded Tripoli, he masterminded Greece, he masterminded Crete, he masterminded all these fiascos. He himself presided over these meetings, and we know how they were conducted because Robert Menzies, the Australian Prime Minister, attended and kept a detailed diary. And in August 1942, I know this is a deep concern to you Canadians, Winston Churchill was personally responsible for the decision to invade at Dieppe, to land Allied British in quotation marks, troops at Dieppe. They were always called British, but of course, as you Canadians know, most of the troops who were given the job of landing on the beaches at Dieppe were Canadian, and not many came back. The reason not many came back, I can reveal to you now, and it's going to be in the Churchill biography, and nobody has ever published this fact before, is that the Germans knew that the target was going to be Dieppe. They knew that the Canadians were coming, and they knew where to expect them, and they were ready. I've got all the German intelligence material relating to this. And far more insidious, not only did the Germans know that Dieppe was going to be the target of that landing, that amphibious raid, we knew that the Germans knew in advance. and yet we still went ahead and landed on Dieppe. And I will tell you the source of this. It is document SRH 013 in the National Archives of the United States, a history of the British and American ultra code-breaking effort, where they give the Dieppe example as one, where we intercepted the German Air Force signals in which it became explicitly clear that the Germans were anticipating an amphibious landing at Dieppe on that day. And you won't find that in any of the Allied official histories, and you know why. Because, of course, I mentioned to you that the official historians were never told about ultra and the code-breaking effort. But as a matter of deep concern for you Canadians, I know that Churchill insisted that the Dieppe raid go ahead, although the Germans knew when and where the Canadians were going to land. And if you want to know why, therefore, the Canadians were sacrificed, I will give you another clue, which I have now from the Russian files, because the Russians, too, have helped this arch-fascist and neo-Nazi David Irving to write the history of the Second World War. They've given me complete access to their records of their meetings with Winston Churchill during the pre-war and wartime years, right up to the Potsdam meeting. I have all the records of their secret meetings with Churchill in the Russian language, which leave out, as you can imagine, quite a lot that is not contained in the British archives. And on this particular occasion, we find a few weeks before Dieppe, Winston Churchill telling the Soviet ambassador in London privately, who was complaining that the British were not doing enough to help the Second Front and to help the Russians in their misery in the run-up to the Stalingrad campaign, of course, Churchill said, "I'm proposing an operation shortly which may well lead to the loss of 50,000 Allied lives. But even if it costs the lives of 50,000 Allied troops, it will be worthwhile if it shows to the Soviet government that we are on their side, body and soul." And even if the operation is a fiasco, he explicitly said that, even if it costs 50,000 lives and is a failure, it will be worthwhile. And this is just a few weeks before the Dieppe operation. So you begin to see the true history of the Second World War, which is being kept from you Canadians too. It's a scandalous episode, and I can understand well that if I had a Canadian publisher, at this point the Canadian publisher might well put his head in his hands and turn the manuscript back to me and say, "David Irving, we can't accept this manuscript. It's telling the Canadian public things that they don't want to be told." But I think that there is a section of the Canadian public who very much wants to be told about this. Why were we fighting the Second World War from 1941 onwards, 42 onwards? What about Dieppe? Why were we helping the Russians to invade Europe? And why were we defeating the one man who was prepared to put up a Bolshevik against the Russians, Adolf Hitler? We told ourselves that we were fighting the devil incarnate. He did all that to the Jews, therefore it was right that we should do everything we can, whatever the cost, in order to defeat him. Well, even this turns out to be untrue, because there is not the slightest evidence that Adolf Hitler knew whatever was happening about the Jews, about the Holocaust, about Auschwitz. I've offered again and again £1,000 English money, 2,000 Canadian dollars, to any historian or private person or institute. I've made this offer in 1977. I've made it ever since over the last 9 years, in television programs, the media, all the way around the world. £1,000 to anybody who can find one wartime document showing that Adolf Hitler even knew about Auschwitz or about whatever was going on the Eastern Front in that particular historical region. And they can't find it, and they huff and they puff, and they all look at each other, all these academic historians, and they say, "Jekyll, you got the proof somewhere, haven't you?" And Jekyll says, "No, I haven't got it. Hillgruber has it." And Hillgruber says, "No, I haven't got it. Jacobson has it." And Jacobson says, "But I quoted Brochard." And Brochard says, "But I thought you had it, Jekyll." And so they go round and round. They all thought that the other person had the evidence, and because they can't prove that they've got the evidence, they all round on me and say, "Irving is a fascist, don't believe him, he's discredited. Nobody accepts what he's got." Well, I've come up in the archives with a whole string of documents which goes even further than this. Genuine documents that meet my criteria, genuine documents written by people in the position to know, documents that have been created not for some exterior or ulterior motive. Genuine documents, a string of documents, a narrow file of documents showing Hitler deliberately, explicitly linked to the Holocaust, as we can say, or linked to the fate of the Jews, that great tragedy, And all these documents show Hitler intervening, trying to stop anything nasty happening to the Jews. There's not one single document showing the other direction of Hitler whipping up the murderers and saying, do this, do that, you're not working hard enough. And I'm going to quote a few examples to you. They're in my book on Hitler, the Hitler's War or the Warpath. The first one is November the 10th, 1938, the famous Night of Broken Glass. Night of Broken Glass, you remember the Reichskristallnacht, the great anti-Jewish pogrom that began on that day. 1,000 Jewish shops were burned down, homes were looted, synagogues were burned down, 150 of them, 60 or 70 Jews were actually murdered. The first that Hitler knew, as I know because I've spoken to all his private staff, was when he got a telephone call that evening at 2:30 in the morning from a hotel in Munich, downtown, saying the Führer's adjutants ought really to come and pick up their baggage from the hotel because a synagogue has just been set on fire next to the hotel. And Hitler's pricked up his ears. He said, what's going on? What the hell is going on? He sends his adjutants, these 6 men, out of their beds. He sends them out into the streets of Munich that night to try and protect individual Jewish shops or businesses that he knows might be at risk. And he calls in his ministers, Goebbels, Hess and the others, and he has them all night in his residence sending out telegrams all night to stop the madness. And one of them I quote, and I printed actually as a facsimile in my book, The Warpath, the 10th of November 1938, on the headed notepaper of Rudolf Hess himself, that man who is a war criminal now in Spandau for the rest of his life, 46 years in prison already. Rudolf Hess sends out a 3-line message that night. Instruction number 172/1938 to all Gauleiters, to all the Nazi officials throughout Germany, on express instructions from the very highest level. Well, Hess is number 2, so this can only be the number 1 man himself. On express instructions from the very highest level, there are to be no outrages or acts of arson whatsoever under any circumstances against the Jewish community or Jewish property. An attempt to stop the madness that has already begun somehow. Nobody is quite sure how it began. But you won't find this document quoted anywhere else except in my book. I found this document, let me say, in the files of the American government in Berlin, the Berlin Document Center. It's a genuine document, there's no denying it, yet you won't find it quoted anywhere. And I'll quote another document to you while I'm about it, because it shows even more graphically that everything that's been said about Adolf Hitler and his part in the Holocaust is probably a load of rubbish. This is the spring of 1942. In the spring of 1942, there's this document, which is in the files of the German Ministry of Justice. It's only a small memorandum, an Aktennotiz, signed by the Deputy German Minister of Justice, Hitler's Minister of Justice, for his own files. And it records a telephone conversation from a man called Hans Lammers, the Reichsminister, the head of the German civil service, like a prime minister in a dictatorship, the spring of 1942. Reichsminister Hans Lammers informs me that the Führer, that's Adolf Hitler, has repeatedly declared to him that he wants the solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. Now, how do you climb out of that one if you're an established historian in a university today? You can't explain it because you're going around telling everyone that Hitler's the man who ordered the killing of the Jews. Hitler ordered the final solution, and yet here's the only document actually linking Hitler and the solution of the Jewish problem with Hitler putting out his hand saying, I want it all postponed, this solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. It raises a whole host of questions, this document. They can't answer it, so you know what they do? They drop it on the floor. They pretend it doesn't exist, and they put their foot on it like a card sharp. They pretend this document doesn't exist. You won't find that document quoted in any of the official histories or in any of the histories around the world. It's a document that just doesn't exist unless you read my book on Adolf Hitler. And it's not the only two, those ones I quoted you. There's a whole string of documents beginning in 1923, the famous Beer Hall Putsch, the evidence given in the trial on that night about how Hitler was overheard talking about the Jews in private, and he found out that night on November the 8th, 1923, that Hitler had heard from a policeman who gave evidence in the Hitler trial a few weeks later. This policeman said, I overheard Adolf Hitler being told that one of the Nazi units had gone berserk in downtown Munich and had ransacked a Jewish shop and had stolen all its property. And Hitler ordered the commander of that unit into his presence, stripped him of all his unit badges and insignia, threw him out of the Nazi party on the spot, and also ordered him to produce a list of all the names of his unit, and he said, neither you nor any member of your unit will ever again be accepted in a patriotic organization. I personally will take care of that. You have brought the entire movement into discredit. That was back in 1923, and it goes right through to 1944, all this string of documents, which you won't see quoted anywhere else, because it doesn't fit in with the romantic notion, the Hollywood legend, the Madison Avenue legend, the one which we fought the Second World War over, if we now look back in hindsight on that ghastly tragedy. What did we fight the war for? Not very much remains then, once we remove the Holocaust and Hitler's personal role. I'm convinced, let me make this quite plain so any media present are not going to misquote me on this, I'm convinced that there was a ghastly tragedy of sorts in the Eastern Front. I'm convinced that this tragedy was perpetrated by a large number of mean-minded, bloodthirsty murderers operating independently without orders from above. They carried it out for the meanest of motives, either out of bloodlust or because they wanted to rob the victims or wherever. And it is the kind of thing that regrettably happens in major wars. It happened in the Vietnam War. You've only got to look at the case of Lieutenant Calais and My Lai, and I'm sure that the American public would be deeply indignant if anyone was to say you are to blame for Lieutenant Calais and My Lai, except, of course, in the broadest kind of sense that their media, their journalism, their television and so on had created the kind of morals which make a My Lai possible. Because, of course, My Lai in the Vietnam War was also a kind of race war, the white Superman against the yellow men, the Gooks, or whatever the Viet Cong were called. But, of course, this is unfashionable to say this, because the whole media, even now, for various reasons, is concentrated, is focused exclusively on World War II and the devil incarnate, which is why we British had to fight him and why we are proud now to be bankrupt. This is basically the story of the Second World War. The biggest lie of the 20th century is that we had no alternative but to fight the Second World War because we were fighting the devil incarnate. And I've given you the examples. I've looked at the Holocaust, I've looked at the Jewish problem, and I've offered one simple yardstick, the whole simple question of poison gas, to make a comparison between Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill. In short, I think that Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill, Harry S. Truman, Roosevelt, Stalin, all these great leaders in the Second World War were roughly much of a muchness when it comes to their criminality. Something comes over people when they get power. There have been various ways expressed of how it is. Something comes over them. A criminal edge overcomes them. They put themselves above normal law, and I don't think Hitler was any more or any less than any of the other ones, and it has to be said, and he was not worth squandering an entire empire over. And that has to be said. The biggest lie of the 20th century was that. We now make a quantum leap forward to the present time, the 1980s. And we have to ask ourselves, if we apply the same sceptical, disbelieving minds to the events of the 1980s, what can we see that we ought to puzzle over? The first case I offer you is Libya. I'm deeply suspicious about Libya. I think that Libya is being set up. I've been thinking this not just recently over the last month or two, I've been thinking it for 2 or 3 years. In fact, the first evidence I had to my own mind to satisfy myself as a naturally suspicious kind of guy was in April 1984, when a little-known episode happened in England. You don't know very much about it here in Canada, so I'll describe it to you. We have a Libyan embassy in England at that time, based in London, in a quiet garden square, St James's Square. And that day there was going to be a counter-demonstration against Colonel Gaddafi outside, and about 20 demonstrators lined up around the railings of this square, opposite the embassy, with 4 or 5 good-natured English policemen to make sure the traffic flowed freely. And a volley of shots rang out, and one of those policemen dropped to the ground, mortally wounded, died a few minutes later. In fact, it was a policewoman, Police Constable Fletcher. And as you know, in Britain we think very highly of our police. For years, in fact, until we had this influx of tourists from the empire, not one of these policemen had to be armed. The famous English bobby never carried the slightest kind of armament, and in fact most of them still don't. We like them, rather like you Canadians like your Mounties. It's a kind of popular tradition. And to see one of them shot down in the back, and in fact a woman shot in the back, was too much for the British. They all rose up in anger against the Libyans, and I said to myself, I don't believe it. Someone's being set up. What is the benefit for the Libyans to do that? And purely by chance, the Libyan embassy had the whole episode filmed because they had a television camera there which they'd hired to film the demonstration for their domestic television, and so the whole thing was on film. Well, you're not going to take that kind of thing on film if you're going to indulge in that kind of hooliganism, which is the first thing that told me something was funny. And then the British newspapers uniformly swung round onto the Libyans as being the obvious culprits, with a unanimity that itself made me suspicious, and the newspapers interviewed people who said, oh yes, I saw a Kalashnikov rifle being pointed out of a window, but the various stories differed as to which level, which floor, which window they'd seen the rifle pointed from. And then it turned out that the body in the policewoman's, the bullet in the policewoman's body was in fact a 9mm bullet, so it couldn't have been fired by a Russian-made Kalashnikov. And again, you get a little bit more suspicious, and I'm just trying to teach you, ladies and gentlemen, how to read the press. Be suspicious. Don't believe everything that's put you in black and white. It sounds stupid, but obviously one's inclination is to believe it. Some newspapers are better than others. The Toronto Globe and Mail is one of the best. The Los Angeles Times is super. The New York Times isn't too bad, except on certain matters concerning the Middle East. American journalism is basically very good. But on Libya, I was not convinced what the British press was telling me. And I said, David Irving, wait until you get the evidence on the angle of entry of the bullet into that woman's body, which will tell you whether it was fired from a window in the embassy or, as I suspected, from the roof, a rooftop nearby. That's what I suspected. And I went round and had a look at the square later, and there were rooftops ideally situated for precisely that purpose. Now listen, the inquest was held. when the pathologist was about to give precisely that evidence, the angle of entry of the bullet into the woman's body, the coroner interrupted him, Dr. Knapman, the West London coroner, and said, "I will not allow evidence to be given here about the angle of entry of the bullet into the woman's body." Now that made me all the more suspicious. I hadn't told anybody that time, but I started writing an article, and this is why I'm a bit proud of this, because I actually had that article published in about a dozen newspapers around the world a few days later, after the following happened. The siege was lifted. The siege of the embassy was lifted. The diplomatic relations were broken off. The embassy was sent back to Libya. We brought our embassy back from Tripoli. It's all rather familiar, isn't it, when you're reading your newspapers today? You set up somebody and you make them break off diplomatic relations, and it all benefits a certain power. Now what happened was we lifted the siege. The Libyan diplomats were sent back to Tripoli. We shut down diplomatic relations between Libya and Britain, and everybody was allowed back into the square again after 7 days. The police withdrew. They'd had their laser acoustic listening devices and everything in the square for a week. And for a week they had been listening into the embassy, and they'd not got the slightest evidence that there was any evidence in that nobody was kind of rounding on somebody else in the embassy and saying, "Abdullah or Ali, why did you fire that stupid round of shots? You got us all in trouble now." You see? Nobody was saying that. So the police packed up and went. And on the day they went, the 7th day, the Times reported a very odd thing. A bullet fired in that volley of shots had gone right across the square, and it had pierced the window of an office building opposite, gone right through, a high-velocity bullet, right through the office window opposite, and it had hit the wall on the other side of the room. So I said, right, at last we've got it. We don't need the policewoman's body anymore, the angle of entry. Now you've got an immovable window and an immovable wall, both with a hole in them, and you can line them up and find out precisely where the shot was fired from. And I went straight down there on my bike, and sure enough, the hole is still in the window. And I went up to the 2nd floor to find out what the position of the hole in the wall was, because I wanted to line it up. And you've guessed it, I wasn't allowed in. The office manager, I telephoned him 2 or 3 times after that evening, and that evening I said, "Why don't you let me come round at 2 minutes past 5 after the office workers have gone home? I'll only be literally 2 minutes just to line it up." And he said, "Mr. Irving, I'm sorry, I know you, I know your work, I'd like to let you in, but we have had orders from the government not to let anyone in. And we have also been ordered to have that pane of glass removed within the next 24 hours and replaced before anyone is allowed in." Well, that stank. And I contacted the Daily Mail in London at the time, and I said, "Why don't we do the following? Why don't we rent one of those mobile platforms, get it on the pavement, on the sidewalk outside that office window? We can line it up ourselves and find out where the shot came from." But I couldn't motivate that newspaper. The newspapers are sometimes not capable of thinking sideways, or they don't want to, who knows. So I wrote the article. It was published at the time, and I forgot about it until the events of the beginning of this year. And at the beginning of this year, of course, there was this strange episode of the discotheque bombing in Berlin. An American soldier was killed when a bomb went off in a discotheque in West Berlin, and immediately the American newspapers started leaking stories that the American intelligence community, the National Security Agency, had intercepted telephone calls from the Libyan embassy in East Berlin to their agent in West Berlin, ordering him to place the bomb. This was the first version of those leaks, those intercepts. We all remember the story, I'm sure. And the Americans went and blasted the hell out of the Libyan capital, Tripoli, and killed Colonel Gaddafi's daughter. And all the damage was done, and for several weeks there was complete instability and uproar in the Middle East.
So this is the room in which Colonel Gaddafi's daughter was killed.
And then another odd thing happened, because they caught the guy who'd actually done the job, who'd planted the bomb in the embassy, and he's coming up for trial in a few days' time. But I don't want to prejudice his case, but I'm sure that this won't go any further. They caught the guy who did it, and he said quite frankly that he hadn't got his orders from anybody but the Syrians, and he was a Jordanian, and he was acting on Syrian orders. So where does this strange business of the intercepted messages from the Libyan embassy to him come from, if he was taking his orders from the Syrians? Well, immediately I thought to myself, the American newspapers who planted that leak are now, any moment now, going to publish a new version of the leak. And sure enough, the next day, the Washington Post, New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, the Wall Street Journal, all the traditional sources of government-inspired leaks came out with a new version. They now reminded readers that 4 weeks before, they had published the fact that the NSA had allegedly intercepted messages from the Libyan embassy in Berlin to their man in West Berlin, congratulating him on having planted the bomb in the embassy. You remember, of course, completely different. The first version was it was an order, in quotation marks. The second version was it was congratulations after the job had been done. They were trying to get out of the hole they'd dug themselves into. And one of the basic lessons, I think, which Dennis Healey, the English politician, once taught me, he said, David, I give you this piece of advice. When you've dug yourself into a hole, stop digging. The Americans haven't learned that lesson. They were continuing to dig then. They told another lie to cover the original lie. And I had the opportunity, in fact, a few days later, May the 6th or thereabouts, I was in Washington. I had an interview with a man who is the very highest official in the American intelligence community. You all know his name. And I spent half an hour chatting with him in his office. And I said to him, I want to ask you something about Libya. He said, sure, David, great, you're looking great. And I say, well, that's because I've been on this round-the-world tour, all these sunny places. It's the summer down in Australia. And he said, I know where you've been. You've been in Perth, you've been in Sydney, Melbourne, all these places. You went round through New Zealand, back up through Fiji, Hawaii, Vancouver, Toronto, Carlton Inn, downtown Toronto, and now you're down here in Washington. So I say, well, Mr. So-and-so, you know his name. I said, well, I'm impressed. He says, yeah, we know quite a lot down here. How's the brown Rolls Royce? You're still driving that around London? You know, it's damn well I'm still driving this brown Rolls Royce around London. And I say, well, all right, I'm even more impressed. You know a great deal about me, but how come you don't know very much about Libya? And he says, what do you mean? What do you mean? So I say, well, you've bombed the hell out of Colonel Gaddafi, you've killed his daughter, you're going around there causing a lot of damage, and yet you haven't got the slightest evidence to link Gaddafi with the terrorism. Anywhere, not just this Berlin one, but in Paris or London or anywhere else. You're shooting your mouth off. And he said, God, Dave, of course we got the evidence. We got the evidence. And I say, if you got the evidence, how come General Vernon Walters had all that trouble persuading the prime ministers of Italy, France, Spain and Germany to allow the overflights? There was not one single document he could show those prime ministers to persuade them that Libya was actually involved. And it's the same case now in the Syrian case, as you notice, rather amusing. And he said, well, you've got to hit back somewhere. So I say, Mr. So-and-so, if you're going to hit back, why don't you hit back at the actual country involved, in this case Syria? So he says, David, listen, Libya, Syria, the American public don't know the difference. That was his answer on May the 6th this year. Libya, Syria, the American public don't know the difference. Now, this, of course, is very serious. Of course, it's completely true. You go down into any street in New York and show them a map of the Mediterranean and say, put an X and a Y where you know that Libya and Syria are, and they'll get it all over the map. It'll be worse than find the football. That's the problem with the Americans. If you ask me now who is setting up whom, and there's no doubt that somebody is being set up, I think the evidence is quite clear. Of course, in August we had this further scandal. Again, outrages. Colonel Gaddafi is understood by the American intelligence community to be planning further terrorist outrages in the West. The Sixth Fleet alters course, bears down on the Libyan coastline, all of this, and then suddenly the miracle happened. Out of the American woodwork, of the American hierarchy, steps this official of the US State Department, Bernard Kalb, who admits that we have been lying from start to finish about Colonel Gaddafi and setting him up. Misinformation is called. Why are we doing it? I don't know. But I must say that I'm deeply concerned to find that here in the West we are carrying out misinformation or lying, propaganda lying, in time of peace against a man who apparently is not involved in terrorism, and we are deliberately destabilizing the Mediterranean region, the Middle East. I can only suspect that the reason is that in order to provide a reason for the pushing of American taxpayers' funds into a Middle Eastern country which benefits from every ounce of instability in that region, this instability, this destabilization is called for. I would also suggest that another reason is probably that it's needed to help the American oil-producing states, because if Libya is knocked out, this will raise the price of the barrel of oil, of crude oil, quite clearly. Louisiana and Texas will benefit. And, of course, our own oil patch in Alberta will benefit. But I'm certain these are the two reasons why Libya was being set up. But I find it deeply offensive that those people in Washington are the same people who are trying to tell us about the truth and about democracy and about civilization. It seems that although I've got the highest respect for President Reagan, as I indeed have, I think that lower down in his hierarchy, they're the same kind of insidious worms, the same kind of corrupt gangsters that we've come to expect from our reading of history. The modern-day equivalents of Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White are still at work in the American government. And I think Larry Speakes is one, if I may say so. Larry Speakes. Larry Speakes, the White House press spokesman. The White House spokesman, I never liked him. Whenever I've seen him at those White House press conferences, I've always thought to myself, he has the typical face of a liar. And now we know, and I give you this clue, the only way to know when Larry Speakes is lying is when his lips move. We are also being lied to, of course, most fundamentally about South Africa. There's no question at all that we're being lied to about South Africa. We're being lied to by our governments, by our media, by the television and by the newspapers. Nobody is telling us what really is at stake in South Africa, although we know what the truth is, and intelligent people know what the truth is, and there is enough writing on the wall. In fact, the Russians have told us quite simply what is at stake in South Africa. Leonid Brezhnev, back in 1971, he told the president of Somalia, who at that time was a Soviet client of his, he told the president of Somalia, our aim is to gain control of the two great treasure houses on which the West depends, the Persian Gulf, which is why, of course, the fighting is going on there at this moment, and the mineral resources of Central and Southern Africa. Central Africa is gone, of course. He said that in 1971. Central Africa has gone Marxist already. All that is left is the final little patch of that equation, South Africa. The mineral resources of South Africa is what it is all about. And I'm not the only person to say this. The Americans themselves, there was a time when they too realized this. General Alexander Haig in 1980 said exactly the same thing. If allowed to obtain South Africa, he said, the USSR will control as much as 90% of several key minerals for which no substitutes have been devised. And I'll give you a few examples so you can see, because I want you all to go home and spread the word, as I've been spreading it all the way around the world, this one-man mission of mine on behalf of freedom. Because I'm not paid by the CIA or by the American or by the South African government or anyone to go around doing this. I go around, as I said earlier, selling books because this is the only way I can finance myself to stand in front of audiences like you and tell you this particular message. And I'm doing it not because it makes profit for me. I have an investment as a citizen of the free world, and I want that free world to stay free as long as possible. This is why I'm doing it. So I want you all to go home and remember just a few of the following statistics which I give you, because that is what answers your own government, your own lunatic government, Brian Mulroney and the rest of them, who are damaging the South African cause and are inflicting permanent damage on the South Africans upon whom we all rely. We, and this is the extraordinary, the damaging, the ghastly, the horrifying fact, we are all dependent on those 5 million whites in South Africa to a degree that you have not yet dreamed of. Those 5 million Englishmen, those 5 million Afrikaners in South Africa, whom we are vilifying and insulting and libeling and defaming and heaping insults upon and now trying to starve into submission. They are the people who are, in fact, the only thin white line which stands between the free world and the ultimate defeat of the free world, the Western world. South Africa has 86% of the world's platinum. 86% of the world's platinum is in South Africa. The other 14% is in the Soviet Union. Between those two countries is a total world monopoly of platinum. And platinum isn't just something that you make necklaces or diamond rings with. Platinum is a vital raw material, a rare metal without which civilization can't survive. Platinum produces 3 million ounces of platinum a year. Sells it entirely to the Western world because the Soviet Union just has enough to keep itself going. 3 million ounces of platinum, of which 1 million ounces of platinum, all of which come from South Africa, go into the automobile and truck and aeroplane industries of the world. You can't make gasoline, you can't refine gasoline without platinum. You don't get the catalysts that you need without platinum, platinized asbestos. There is no substitute for platinum. There's no other comical mineral you can find which you can take out the platinum and put in platinum instead. It has to be platinum. You can't have electronics, radar, computers, silicon chips, wireless sets, televisions, telecommunications, the motor car industry, or gasoline without platinum. Without South Africa, you don't get platinum. Without platinum, you don't have any of that. How are you going to fight a war? How are you going even to defend yourself for 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years without platinum? Without South Africa, you won't get it. And it isn't just platinum, it's other raw materials like chrome. South Africa has 83%. 83% of the world's chrome. The Soviet Union only has 1%. The Soviet Union needs the chrome of South Africa in order to make steel. You can't make steel without chrome. I know you know this, ladies and gentlemen. 25 years ago, I was a steel worker in Germany, in the Ruhr, bending down on the furnace stage, picking up the lumps of raw chrome and tossing them into the pot of 200 tons of molten steel along with the other ingredients, the additives like the ingots of aluminium, the manganese, and all the other ingredients that go to make steel. Without chrome, you can't make steel. Without South Africa, you don't get chrome. equation. Without South Africa, you have no steel production. Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, all your great steel centers in the United States, in North America, are going by the board without South Africa. Ask your gentleman in Ottawa, ask Mr. Clark or Mr. Mulroney, if you're all right, you're shutting down tourism to South Africa, you're preventing SAA from flying down there, jolly well and good, hats off. Huge applause, no doubt, especially from your pigmented voters. Where are you going to get the platinum? Where are you going to get the platinum and the chrome from for your industries? Or haven't you bothered to think about that yet? The word yet is important, because sooner or later it will be too late. If you haven't thought about it now, then you've jolly well got to start thinking about it, because believe me, ladies and gentlemen, I've only mentioned 2 examples of raw materials which South Africa has a virtual monopoly of. Platinum and chrome are the 2 essential ones, but you've got other ones like vanadium, without which you can't make jet engines. Palladium, diamonds and gold, of course, and a whole catalogue of other raw materials that you won't get from South Africa if South Africa goes the Marxist way. It's the indirect means of war, and the Russians have always used this indirect means of fighting war at every level. They've used the surrogates like the Cubans to fight their war in Angola, and when they have won South Africa by indirect means, by which I mean in this case they're using the unfortunate blacks and Indians and Asians and coloureds as their pawns, because the damage that is being done in South Africa, the terror that is being done there inside the black townships, is being done by black to black. This is part of the cynicism of the whole communist operation. They proclaim to the world that they are the supporters of the coloureds and the underdogs, but in fact it is the black populations who are suffering from the communist invasion. Since the Black Power movement began in 1970, 5 million blacks have already been killed on the African continent, and one Marxist government after another had been established, and the only one which survives is down in South Africa. And thank God for that, because if South Africa goes, the whole of the Western world can say good night, gute Nacht, goodbye, farewell, adieu. The Western world is indefensible. All that's going on in Reykjavik, in Helsinki, in Geneva for the last 30 or 40 years, the talk about SDI, Star Wars, non-proliferation pacts, all this talk about the nuclear missiles and agreements and inspection and the rest of it is all a big red herring designed to distract us from the fact that World War III has begun already some time ago. You don't need to know when it began. What matters for us is when it ends, because if it ends badly for us all and not just for the South Africans. Those of you who are waiting for World War III to begin, imagining that you will recognize the beginning of World War III when bombers fly overhead with their bomb doors opening, or mushroom clouds on the horizon, all these old-fashioned notions of how wars are fought today, you are not aware of the fact that wars are never fought like the wars before. Generals at the beginning of World War II, particularly the French generals, thought that it would begin with trench warfare like World War I, and that's the mistake we're making today. World War III is already being fought down in South Africa, and thank God we've got these 5 millions that we can rely on. And I know it because I've gone and spoken to them. I've looked them in the eye. I've looked these people in the eye and I've spoken to them and I've said, for God's sake, hold on. I'm going to come back every 6 months now from now until this particular crisis has passed to South Africa to encourage you. I'm going back to South Africa next March to an even bigger tour. This time 50 or 60 cities. I shall probably speak to 500,000 South Africans and I shall tell them the one message from coast to coast and from frontier down to the tip, down to the Cape of Good Hope. I shall tell them the same thing. South Africa, it is time to fight back. And of course if they fight back... If they fight back, then we shall see what the Mr. Mulroneys and the Mr. Clarks and the President Reagans and his Secretaries of State like Chester Crocker and Henry Kissinger shall say then. Because when the fight-back moment comes, then you will realize how dependent you are on the South Africans. And I hope to God that time comes sooner or later. Because if it comes too late, then the Russians, the communists, will have succeeded. I've attended the meetings of the South African Communist Party in England. I've got in there and I've sat in and I've listened to them talking about their secret plans for seizing power in South Africa. And let me tell you this, they are duping the blacks in South Africa. Africa. The South African Communist Party, headed by a greasy Lithuanian Jew called Joe Slovo, born in Russia, a KGB colonel, a British citizen by permission of Mrs. Thatcher, operating his terror campaign from North London, from Euston Road in North London, directing the terrorist organisation Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is making the fire bombings and the necklacings in the black townships, with Mrs. Thatcher's permission from North London, along with Dennis Goldberg, this strange man who's only recently been here in South Africa. Dennis Goldberg, who was imprisoned with Nelson Mandela as a convicted terrorist for life, because he was found with Nelson Mandela, and on their possession in their hands were the actual plans for the manufacture of 210,000 hand grenades and 48,000 landmines, which is why they were sentenced to life imprisonment. These two arch-communists and murderers. Dennis Goldberg was foolishly released by the South African government last January because he gave his Boy Scouts word of honour that he wouldn't do it again, and he wouldn't commit any further acts of terrorism, and he fled to Israel, where he told horrified Israeli audiences that he intended to start doing the whole terror and murder campaign all over again, and it was the civilians' fault if they got in the way of the bullets and got killed themselves, his precise words. And now he's operating from London, and occasionally he comes here to Canada, where he speaks by permission of your television corporations like CBC. I saw him on the television being interviewed oh so politely by such a genteel interviewer who asked him all these questions, and if you look in the newspapers you'll see he's described as Dennis Goldberg, civil rights activist. What about the civil rights of the blacks who are being necklaced and killed in the black townships of South Africa by courtesy of his organisation Umkhonto we Sizwe? This is Dennis Goldberg. It is time that the Western governments ganged up on these gangsters and murderers and said, Mrs. Thatcher should to Joe Slovo, get out, carry out your operations from behind the Iron Curtain where you belong, where you get your literature produced and manufactured. Dennis Goldberg should be refused admission to South Africa along with all the other murderers who have the blood of innocent citizens on their hands. Tim the Gubani, who went to California only last October to explain why they're carrying out the necklacings and tire burnings. Let me explain what a necklacing is. The black communists, the young lions as they're called down there, the black communists who've been infiltrated by the African National Congress, the members of the Umkhonto we Sizwe, spearhead of a nation in Zulu, Umkhonto we Sizwe, they get hold of somebody in the black townships they don't like, a traffic warden or a rent collector or some other figure, symbol of authority. They take him round the back, they cut off his hands with machetes, they drop a tire, a rubber tire, over his head, they soak him in diesel fuel and set him on fire, and he burns alive. They char him, as they say themselves. We char the men to a despicable mess so that nobody in their wildest dreams thinks of ever working for the government, even in the black townships, again. This is the cynical, cruel, unchristian way that the African National Congress is operating. And if the media of North America want to find some other reason why they should in fact be attacking the African National Congress, let me say that nowhere have I found such vitriolic anti-Semitism, such outpourings of anti-Zionist hatred as in the pages of the African National Congress, which is operating against South Africa, and yet you don't see that referred to anywhere in the North American media, and certainly not here in Canada. Because the truth, of course, is always given a different sheen. And if there's one thing that characterizes politicians here in the West, as opposed to those who are operating on the other side of the Iron Curtain, is something that Adolf Hitler said in admiration of Joseph Stalin, because Hitler did admire Stalin. I know this from Hitler's staff. They told me that the boss, or AH, or the chief as they called him, had the highest private admiration of Stalin and the way that he had lifted his people up out of the morass. And if there's one thing that characterized Stalin is what Hitler said about him. That man thinks in centuries. The Russians think in terms of centuries. And can you, ladies and gentlemen, think of one single politician here in Canada or on the entire North American continent who thinks in terms of centuries? They don't. They think in terms of one riding or one constituency to the next, from one election to the next, from one pay packet to the next, from one scandal, Billy Joe, whatever it is, Mr. Turner, whatever the scandal is in whichever country it is, whatever little tidbit the newspapers feed to them, from one television program, from one Dallas or one dynasty to the next. That's all your population is trained to think. You cannot think in terms of decades, let alone in terms of centuries. Is there one statesman in the entire Western world who thinks ahead beyond the next 10 or 20 years? None of them do. In Britain, the oil is going to run out in 20 years, but nobody's thinking about that disaster that's going to come now. But the Russians think in terms of centuries, and they don't mind how many blacks they kill in Africa in order to get their way. And so they are being patient. They've been trying since 1922, since the Communist Party was founded in July 1921, in fact, in South Africa, to gain their way. They're the white hand inside the black glove of the African National Congress. They've been trying ever since then, and occasionally they've come close to success, because South Africa holds the platinum key to world revolution. I've told you. And so they keep trying, they keep pushing. Every 8 or 9 or 10 years, there's a crisis in South Africa, and the whole of the Western media kicks in. They all join in. And if you wonder why, then I offer you a solution, ladies and gentlemen. the media, the journalists, the television commentators, the politicians. They are all the people that I describe as the intellectual Italians of the world. The intellectual Italians. Let me explain. Hitler once said, I think it was just after Pearl Harbor, he said, we can't lose the war now. We've got an ally, meaning the Japanese, who haven't ever been defeated in 3,000 years. He said, of course, we've got another ally, the Italians, who've been repeatedly defeated. But they've always managed to end up on the right side at the end. And he was right. Of course, the Italians changed sides in 1940. In fact, I think it was Napoleon who said, the Italians have never yet managed to end a war on the same side that they started it. Except for one occasion when they changed sides twice. One occasion when they changed sides twice, they ended up on the same side. I mention that because I've coined this phrase of the intellectual Italians. These are the gentlemen in the media here in North America and in Britain too, the journalists, the commentators, the reviewers, whatever they are, the politicians too. They've got this kind of unspoken notion that perhaps, given the weight of propaganda, the enemy may win. So even though they don't want to show it, they've got one leg in the enemy camp, just like the Italians in 1943 and in all the other wars they fought. They've got one leg in the enemy camp, and it's a very ungainly stance to try and maneuver freely while that leg's pinned down in the enemy camp. I've spoken to the journalists in the BBC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation and elsewhere, and they've admitted it. They've grinned foolishly when I said, what do you expect to do when the ANC takes power here in Pretoria? And they grinned foolishly. And I say, I know why you're grinning. You don't want to admit it, but you think you're going to keep your job. Well, look northwards. Look to Zimbabwe or the other British Rhodesias. Look to all the countries where the Marxists have taken power. How many of you intellectual Italians have managed to hold on to your jobs? The answer is none of you. Most of you are floating face downwards in the river. That's what happens to you in a black African, in black power state. And of course they don't want to accept it because they're busy doing the other ungainly dance, which is a feature of the intellectual Italians, walking with one leg on each side of the fence, like this. And it's a very ungainly walk, depending on how high that fence is. Why can't, I've said this in Pretoria, why doesn't your Minister of Information fight back using the immense propaganda possibilities that you have? Why don't they say that the outside world is making the wrong comparisons? Why don't they say, as I say all over the Northern Hemisphere, black power, good, in theory, in practice, how are you going to do it? Which tribe do you have in mind for power in Pretoria? Which tribe? In Africa, in the whole of Africa, you've got 2,000 different black tribes, 2,001 tribes if you include the white tribe, right? Which, in South Africa, you've got 12 tribes. So which tribe are you going to give the power to in Pretoria when the Black Revolution comes? The Xhosas, the Zulus, the Tswanas, the Sothos, the Ovambos, the Hereros, you've got a dozen tribes, and not one of them can stand the other. So if you give it to the cause, and the African National Congress is largely Xhosa, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Alfred Nzo, they're all Xhosas. Bishop Tutu's a Xhosa too. Bishop Tutu, he's a Xhosa as well, except that he comes from the bottom left-hand corner of the Xhosas, right? I would call it the Simon Wiesenthal corner of the Xhosas. He is in a corner of the Xhosa tribe that no self-respecting Xhosa, let alone a Zulu, would ever take orders from. You've got to know this, but of course this is the kind of intricacy of the tribal setup in South Africa that you are not being told by your media. You're just being told the rather kind of Orwellian equivalent of 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. Black is good, white is bad. And anybody who says it the other way round is a racist. This is the puzzling thing. Well, I say that the South African government, and indeed we ourselves should say, the correct comparison is not between the standard level of the blacks in South Africa and the standard level of the whites, although there is an imbalance. The correct comparison is to say to the blacks in South Africa, do you want to live on as you are now, or do you want to go even further down and live like the blacks in Mozambique, or the blacks in the Belgian Congo, in the Zaire, in Zimbabwe, and in Zambia? This is the way it has to be put, and it's so obvious. Everywhere the Marxists have taken power, the blacks are suffering. I'll give you one example. The Belgian Congo, which is now called Zaire, the life expectancy in that country is now an average of less than 40 years. 20 years ago, when the whites were still in power in the Belgian Congo, they were the richest and one of the best looked after, one of the healthiest of the African nations. It slumped. The same in Mozambique. 250,000 white Portuguese have fled. Mozambique is now an economic shambles. And it's the same. I can give you an example here, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll bear with me a few more minutes. Out of the files of Idi Amin comes this document. A friend of mine went into Idi Amin's office on the day that he was overthrown and picked it up off his desk along with a box of medals. Idi Amin's medals, I've got them all in my office in London now. And whenever I feel low in spirits, occasionally I put on some of Idi Amin's medals and I parade before a mirror. Poor old Idi, he hasn't got these medals, I have. He hasn't got this document either, I have. It's Idi Amin's personal inquiry Ugandan airfield at Entebbe to rescue some Palestinian-held hostages from an Air France Airbus. A gallant operation, magnificent moves have been made by Hollywood about this Israeli operation, and here's Idi Amin's court of inquiry into what happened. A British government-style court of inquiry held with full majesty, pomp and panoply. Questions and answers from Lieutenant Fulgencio Bayegaruba, second in command of B Company on the airfield at Entebbe that night. You had troops under your control. Why did you hide? I didn't hide, I only took cover. What orders did you give as an army officer? All my troops ran away. I couldn't give orders to anybody. You ran all the way to Katabi, I understand. Whom do you think was to control the troops? There was nobody to command because all my troops ran away. Now, the next officer who gives evidence is Lieutenant Raphael Osacha. I mean, you could write a book based just on this, or Idi Amin could, but of course he can't because I've got it. The whole report is 400 pages long. I just brought along a few pages of it because I had to land in Uganda on the way up to South Africa. Statement by Lieutenant Raphael Osacha of State Research. Now, you remember what state research is in a black power state? It's nothing to do with laboratories and stopwatches and thermometers. State research is the Gestapo. It's the Terror, Torture and Investigation Unit, and this is the lieutenant who's in charge of the Gestapo unit, the state research, on the airfield at Entebbe on that memorable historic night. He says, at the time shooting broke out, I was down in the basement torturing a suspect. I ran out, and on reaching the ticket sales counter, I was halted by an Israeli soldier. I refused, pointing my pistol at him. He ducked and take cover. At this point, his heroism gave out. I ran upstairs and I hid in a lady's toilet. Later, somebody come and knock at the door of this toilet. I shot at him through the door. But unluckily, this was not an enemy. This person went and reported that an Israeli was hiding in the lady's toilet. This is when his troubles begin. His troubles begin. Anyway, following morning, the planes have all taken off. At what time did you come out of the toilet? At dawn, when the Israelis had already left. So he's okay. They had a Jeep on the airfield with a 106mm gun mounted on it. Now, of course, that could have done quite a lot of damage to those three jumbo jets if it had got close enough, or even from a range of half a mile, probably. But it never occurred to the man in charge to put a few rounds into those Israeli planes. I can find it. What did you do? I took over. Well, I think it's probably I took cover. I think it's till morning? Yes. Was there any firing in that position? No. Did anybody pass by the position you were in? No. Who woke you? I was awake all night. And then the final question is put to the colonel in charge of airfield defense. I mean, obviously there's a lot more I could read out if we had time. The colonel in charge of airfield defense, black power. I mean, I read this document out to South African Defence Forces, to Southwest African Territorial Forces, who are the same thing. They wear a different uniform. South African Army in Windhoek, and also the ones who are fighting in Angola and in Mozambique. I read this out. I read it out to brigadiers, colonels, police officers, security officers. You can imagine the reception it got. And I said, when you hear something like this, doesn't it make you positively itch to go to certain places and do things in a certain way? What weakness on our part? The colonel in charge has asked us, what weakness on our part enabled the Israelis to successfully raid Entebbe? This is the important question. The answer is as follows. Dear people who are here, we didn't know they were coming. They surprised us, and they used force in rescuing the hostages. If the Israelis had informed us they were coming, they would have found us ready. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I read this out purely as an example of what the enemy, how weak the enemy really are. And of course, this is what the Marxists know too, because if black power takes over in South Africa, they will be swept aside in due course by the Marxist regime about which we are all really concerned. And if the Marxists take over South Africa, the whole of the free world can, as I say good night, because you cannot then defend the free world. The planes will be grounded, the radar won't work, you can't make the gasoline, you won't get the steel. There's no possibility of fighting. The war will be over before we've even had a chance of fighting it, before we even had a chance of putting up a fight. And of course, it is no good pointing to the graves of Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Clark and saying, as I say now about Winston Churchill, these were the villains who let down the side for their own personal opportunism and advancement. These were the intellectual Italians who betrayed the entire free world. What we have to realize is what the position is now. The entire free world, 1 billion people, depends on 5 million Afrikaners and Englishmen who are holding the line in Africa despite everything, the vitriol that we are pouring on them. And so I say to you, as I say to them, going around South Africa, look around and realize that you cannot be isolated, that you are not alone, that there are intelligent faces and people who've come individually to come and hear me tonight, and I've told you the facts, and I've told you to be on guard, to accept that any organization or body, any association, any person who tells you something which in the depth of your own mind you recognize as being odd and treacherous and traitorous, say to yourself, he's probably a communist front or the front of a communist front. He's operating against the interests of Canada, North America, the free world. You are entitled to say that in the privacy of your own mind and to be on guard and to say it to your most trusted friends as I'm saying it to you now. And we can all rest confident in the one recognition of recent history. For 60 years, the South African Communist Party have imagined that the day would come when they would give South Africa the final heave-ho. Just as they had the hammer and sickle flying on the town halls of Johannesburg and Cape Town in 1922, 1 year after they came to power, South African Revolution nearly took place then. They thought that only a few more battles, at that time it was a great big miners' strike of Witwatersrand, that they only had to give one more push and they would have the communist empire established in South Africa then, and with it the whole of the free world would go down. That was back in 1922. And communist leaders have come and gone since then in South Africa and in the free world. And in South Africa I've told them, bear this in mind. Those communist leaders, each of them thought, as do the communist leaders now, like Bishop Tutu and Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela and the rest of them, that their great victory was just around the corner when they would see the flag flying over the whole of South Africa, and therefore the ultimate speedy decline and demise and revolution in the whole of the free world. But they are all united by one thing, those communist great leaders, those great communists of the South African history, the names like Olive Schreiner, T.J. Bain, Bill Andrews, Tom Matthews, Wilson Wilson, Solly Zaks, Izzy Diamond, the demon barber of Johannesburg, with his extraordinary Bolshevik clientele. They're all united by one thing. They all thought that they were going to see victory in that time, and they're all dead now. They're all in paradise up above, except for one man, David Ivor Jones, the communist leader, who is buried in the Kremlin wall in Moscow, from which there is no escape. They're all dead. They all thought that they were going to see it, and none of them did. And so I say that same great hope should inspire us all, provided we stand firm and we are not betrayed from within the way that the Americans were betrayed from within during their Vietnam War. Provided we recognize the dangers and we stand firm and we tell the South Africans by whatever way we can, by letters to the editor, to the politicians, by talking it out loud the way I'm telling you now, provided we stand firm, I am convinced they will not see that day when the flag flies over the whole of the free world, when the whole of the free world goes down because of the stupid, short-sighted blunders of our time-serving politicians of today. I am convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that the time will come when every person in this room sees the decline and demise of the Soviet Union first.
Can you take a few questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, would like to commence with the questions and answers.
Yes, his question there.
Mr. Irving, surely in the world context it really doesn't matter what pinheads like Joe Clark and Brian Mulfoney do.
Yes.
But surely Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan and their staffs and their advisors must be aware of the importance of platinum and manganese and chrome.
It is, and the question is, why aren't the world's leaders aware of the importance of platinum, chrome, manganese, vanadium, and so on? Names mentioned like Mrs. Thatcher, Mulroney, and Clark. Well, the answer is this is the great puzzle, and the United States Senate had a special foreign relations committee investigating the growth of communist subversion in southern Africa in 1982, and this was one conclusion they came to, that it's one of the most baffling aspects of the whole of the operation, that although undoubtedly it operates and militates against the interests of the free world, none of the so-called media giants and the politicians, the statesmen, have yet recognized this and have recognized where the true interests of the Western world lie. And I myself can offer no solidly based conviction as to why our leaders are operating in the other way. It's rather as though they're hypnotized in some way, or perhaps because they're frightened of what their voters who have been hypnotized will say about them. Bobby Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, for example, he goes down to South Africa and he mouths off about the position of the blacks, the plight of the blacks in South Africa. All that the South African government has to do, in my view, is just show video film over their television system of the plight of the blacks in Edward Kennedy's own constituency in Boston, in the suburbs there. And I've seen them myself. And they live there in far worse conditions than the blacks are living in Crossroads or in Soweto and the black townships in South Africa. But the politicians don't have the courage to say that, and the newspapers certainly are not offering us a lead.
Or the Indians in Canada.
Or the Indians in Canada is another example. I mean, how can you talk about apartheid in this country when you have situations which are absolutely 100% parallel of the apartheid system in South Africa, which of course is not to be construed as a criticism by me of your reserve system here in this country. Yes.
I'd read that the Enigma machine was kept under wraps with the bombing raid of Coventry.
Well, the Enigma machine. The question is, was the Enigma machine kept secret until the bombing raid of the Germans on Coventry in November 1940? There are two controversies here. The first controversy is, yes, we were reading the German Air Force signals, the operational signals from May 1940 onwards, and so we did know in enough time that Coventry was the target of the night of November the 14th, 1940. We knew it by that afternoon, in fact. There's also a Coventry within a controversy because, I have discovered from my own reading of the British files and from my possession of Churchill's diary, this diary which I've rented, the fact that on that afternoon Churchill believed that the target was going to be London. He was so told by the Air Ministry, who told him that they expected to know by 4 o'clock that afternoon the true target, but they believed the target to be London. And Churchill, as usual, whenever London was expecting an air raid, jumped into his car in the back garden gate of number 10 Downing Street and fled for the country. He fled for a little hidey hole he had in Oxfordshire, where he always spent the night when air raids took place on London. And it was only as his car was passing Hyde Park that he was overtaken by the news from the Air Ministry that the German blind bombing beams had now been switched on, and they intersected over Coventry, not over London, whereupon Churchill ordered the driver to turn back to number 10 Downing Street, where he arrived at 5 o'clock that evening. His staff were very astonished that he had come back, and he explained to his staff, waving the envelope of the piece of information he had received from the Air Ministry. He didn't tell them exactly what it said. He said, "I have just received this most doleful piece of information from the Air Ministry that there is to be a savage and barbarous Nazi air raid tonight on London," which was a complete lie, because he'd been told it was the opposite. It was going to be on Coventry. So he said there's going to be a Nazi air raid on London, and it would not be right if the citizens of this metropolis were to gain the impression that I was unwilling to take the medicine that is being meted out to them night after night by the Nazi barbarians. So I have come back. And that night he actually went onto the roof at 8 o'clock that night, onto the roof of his house, to await the oncoming Nazi bombers, like this. This is in the private diaries of his staff, his secretaries, and it's only when we know what the actual Air Ministry message said, which was at 4 o'clock that afternoon, Prime Minister, all is clear, London is not the target, it's going to be Coventry, 300 miles to the north. That is why he turned back to London that day. And unfortunately, this is another aspect of the picture of Winston Churchill that people are going to find very unpalatable. And I can't apologize enough for this fact, because I know I'm destroying a lot of cherished illusions about Churchill, and a lot of Canadians have found this very difficult. And in Chilliwack, where I spoke, for example, one couple got up and walked out after about a half an hour of my talk because they just couldn't take it any longer. And I do respect that. I've got the utmost sympathy for that, because if you've been brought up for 40 years on a lie, it's very difficult to have to accept it in the autumn of your life.
So is the
Yes.
preserving, excuse me, Mr. Irving, is the preserving of the Enigma secrecy, is that a cover-up for what happened?
Well, the Enigma machine was kept secret until 1974, and that is the fact that we were reading the German machine codes. Obviously, if it turns out that we were reading the German machine codes, this makes Field Marshal Montgomery's efforts all that much less important in the desert. It makes it plain how we managed to defeat the Germans. In fact, it raises the enormous question, how did the Germans manage to fight on for 6 years when we were reading all their signals? In other words, it rather detracts from the level of the Allied victory when you see that.